The Brandenburg Gate in the heart of the city of Berlin. In May 1945, Berlin had fallen to the Russians. Hitler was dead. Germany lay powerless. 3 years later, another battle was fought in Berlin, but this time it was a political battle. A monument stands outside Tempelhof Airport in Berlin. It's a reminder of the 79 people who died in the struggle to keep this city open to the West. Berlin in 1945 seemed a ghost city, and it was a divided city. That had already been decided by the three Allied leaders who at Potsdam were settling the shape of the post-war world. They divided the whole of Germany into 4 zones of military occupation. Although it was in the Russian zone, Berlin, the former capital, came in for special treatment. It too was carved up into 4 sectors. For the first 2 months, the Russians were the sole military occupiers of Berlin. They tried to get the city started again. On July the 1st, 1945, British, American and French garrisons moved into their sectors of Berlin. In public, the wartime Allies were still the best of friends. They defeated Hitler together. They divided Germany together. But beneath all the comradeship, disagreements were starting. The Russians proposed that the biggest socialist party in Germany should combine with the communists. But the socialists in the western sectors insisted on putting it to the vote. Many of them suspected that unity with the communists might mean unity under the communists. As it turned out, a large majority in the western sectors rejected the Russian idea. This was a setback for Stalin. The Red Army still had 2 million men under arms. Stalin was determined to make Eastern Europe into a buffer zone to protect Russia. In March 1946, Churchill voiced a new phrase, the Iron Curtain.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent.
In Berlin, military leaders from all 4 powers sat in the Allied Control Council. The council ran the country and the city. All decisions had to be unanimous. The council agreed on how people and goods must get to Berlin from the west. 1 highway from Hanover via Magdeburg to Berlin, 1 railway, Hanover, Magdeburg, Berlin, an air corridor from Hamburg to Berlin, another from Hanover, a 3rd from Frankfurt. In the October 1945 elections, the Russians had great hopes that the communist-led Socialist Unity Party would win. It flopped. Led by Ernst Reuter, the non-communist Social Democratic Party got almost half of the votes throughout the city. Rebuilding had hardly got underway. Everything was rationed. The Allies disagreed about how to cope with inflation and the flourishing black market. In January 1947, Britain and America combined their zones into a single economic unit. In March 1948, they went even further. In London, they decided to press ahead without the Soviet Union and plan a separate West German state. In Berlin, the Russians wanted to know what had been decided in London. General Clay, the American representative, wouldn't tell them. The Russians walked out. It brought Allied cooperation to an end. The Russians began to apply traffic restrictions on routes to the west. Marshall aid was helping West German industry to revive, but a further step was being considered, to replace the inflated wartime currency with a more stable one. The Russians saw this as a provocative move because they wanted to introduce their own currency, not only into the Russian zone, but also in Berlin. However, the Western Allies announced that only their currency would circulate in West Berlin. The contest was on. On June the 24th, the Russians stopped all rail traffic to Berlin. On August the 24th, Autobahn and canal links were severed. Gas and electric supplies from East Berlin were cut. Berliners living and working in the western sectors seem to be facing a very hard winter. On June the 25th, the Western Allies started an airlift to provide 2 million people with the necessities of life.
To begin with, the routine was that you had an aircraft allocated to you. As soon as it was loaded, you took off from Wunstorf, came to Gatow, unloaded, went back, and waited again for your aircraft to be loaded. You did 3 of these trips and then were given the 24-hour stand-down period. You had to keep very exact timing coming up the corridor because there was another aircraft 30 seconds ahead of you at the same level, and you were probably in cloud. And if you missed out on your speed or didn't see the ground at this end of Gatow, then you overshot and there was no other slot for you to come back round in again. You went back to your base. This was another thing which impressed me immensely, again in the early period. During this bad weather, on an afternoon off, I sat out on the airfield at Wunstorf, and there was low cloud and there was rain. And I watched from that same hole in the cloud this constant procession at 30-second intervals coming into land. There were aircraft landing as others were taking off. They were streaming onto the tarmac. They were being unloaded by the German workers, who incidentally were on the aircraft before you almost stopped. And you were away again. And this was the overall impression, a constant stream of stuff, never ending, day and night.
5,000 tons a day kept coming. Food, coal, oil, despite the weather, despite accidents.
The 100th day of Russian blockade, but Moscow hadn't counted on the determination of the Western Allies, nor had Moscow counted on the will of the Berlin people. The Russian blockade slashed transportation. The people walked. The Russian blockade cut gas supplies. The people got used to cooking slowly. The Russian blockade brought darkness to the city. The people got used to candlelight.
The Russians kept up the political pressure. The Berlin City Council was still meeting in the Russian sector until communist-led crowds besieged the town hall. The council moved to the western sectors and continued to meet. On September the 5th, the Social Democrats called a mass rally. Mayor Reuter spoke for 350,000 Berliners.
Amerika, in England, in Frankreich, in Italien, schaut auf diese Stadt und erkennt, dass ihr diese Stadt und dieses Volk nicht preisgeben dürft, nicht preisgeben könnt.
The Berliners' refusal to panic, plus the Allied aircraft, proved too much for the Russians. They couldn't crush West Berlin economically, they couldn't win it politically. Stalin had his own problems and was in no position to fight. In January 1949, Stalin said the Russians were ready to negotiate, and on May the 5th, the blockade ended. On July the 14th, 1949, the Soviet Union exploded its first atomic bomb. The 4 years of American nuclear monopoly were over. To Western eyes, Stalin's power to enforce his threats seemed immeasurably greater.
12 nations combined in a united front from the Tropic of Cancer to the North Pole. Signing Great Britain into this group of nations are Ernest Bevin.
The North Atlantic Treaty Organization drew Europe and America together against what was seen as the threat of communism. Yet it was in Korea, in June 1950, that the next crisis came on the other side of the world. Japan had lost Korea at the end of the war. The Americans accepted the Japanese surrender below the 38th parallel, the Russians above it. North Korea became communist, the South set up a kind of democracy. Each leader claimed the right to govern the whole peninsula. Tension erupted on June the 25th, 1950, when North Korean divisions crossed the 38th parallel into South Korea. The South Koreans appealed to the United Nations. Following an American proposal, the Security Council decided at once to help South Korea. The Russians were boycotting the council at the time, otherwise they'd certainly have vetoed the plan. First American, then British troops were sent to Korea. They were later joined by troops from 14 other nations. By August the 1st, the North Koreans had pushed to the perimeter of Busan, leaving the South only a toehold on the peninsula. In just 5 weeks, a whole population had become refugees. American bombing of the North Korean advance added to the civilian misery. The United Nations planned a counterattack. On September the 15th, United States General Douglas MacArthur carried out a maneuver to cut off the enemy. 2 U.S. divisions landed at Incheon. Tides and weather made it risky, but it was a success. Within 3 days, the landing was established. Caught between Incheon and the United Nations attack from the south, the North Korean army melted away. MacArthur received orders to destroy the enemy in North Korea. Much of their equipment had been supplied by the Russians. The UN pressed northwards. MacArthur had orders not to cross the Yalu River into China, nor to use troops near the Russian border. Mao Zedong in China was concerned about the fate of communist North Korea and about the security of China. As MacArthur pressed on, 200,000 Chinese moved into North Korea. On November the 24th, the two sides met head-on. Now MacArthur's advance became a retreat. U.S. President Truman looked to the Security Council for a way out.
If aggression is successful in Korea, we can expect it to spread throughout Asia and Europe and to this hemisphere. We have committed ourselves to the cause of a just and peaceful world order through the United Nations. There is, however, no indication that the representatives of Communist China are willing to engage in this process.
The Russian delegate demanded that the United Nations forces should withdraw. Among the British forces trying to halt the Chinese advance was Jack Hobbs.
We found ourselves on the south bank of the River Imjin. We took up our positions on the hilltops around. There we waited and watched. As night drew on, we knew the Chinese were there. We could hear them. They were chattering, shouting to each other, probably to keep their courage up, probably frightened the same as we were. Then came a series of bugle calls, whistles. This was their method, and this continued right throughout the night. Next morning, the adjutant, who was exasperated by these bugle calls, said to me, "Have we got a bugle up here?" I said, I think the drum major's got one, sir. He said, well, tell him to blow. I said, what shall he sound? He said, anything except retreat. Then, on the Sunday night, they came. Masses of them. They must have had unlimited manpower. Eventually, after 3 days and nights of fighting, a quick check of the remaining ammunition revealed about 3 rounds per man. The colonel received permission from brigade to evacuate the hill.
Later, the Americans said this stand by the Gloucesters was one of the greatest acts of bravery in modern warfare. MacArthur had disobeyed orders in pushing so far north. Truman decided he must go.
It was with the deepest personal regret that I found myself compelled to take this action. General MacArthur is one of our greatest military commanders. But the cause of world peace is much more important than any individual.
General Ridgway took over a desperate situation. United Nations troops drew up a final line of defense near Seoul and held it. With the battle lines stalemated, the Russian delegate at the United Nations spoke.
The Soviet people believed that as a first step, discussions should be started between the belligerents for a ceasefire and an armistice, providing for the mutual withdrawal of forces from the 38th parallel.
In a tea house at Keesong on July the 10th, 1951, ceasefire talks began. It soon became clear the talks were getting nowhere. They ended a month later. They'd achieved nothing. During another miserable winter, fighting continued. In October 1952, a new American president was elected.
Now, where will the new administration begin? It will begin with its president taking a firm, simple resolution. That resolution will be to forego the diversions of politics and to concentrate on the job of ending the Korean War. I shall go to Korea.
In December 1952, he went. Eisenhower hinted afterwards that strong military action would have to be taken to end the stalemate. In America, there was talk of using nuclear weapons. In the Soviet Union, Stalin died. Truce talks began again at Panmunjom in April 1953. This time they actually made progress. But Syngman Rhee, president of South Korea, raised obstacles. Rhee wanted a South Korean army of 20 divisions trained by the Americans. He demanded reunification of South and North. The South Koreans lost many more troops before Rhee finally agreed to sign an armistice. At Panmunjom on July the 13th, 1953, an armistice was agreed based on a military truce line. That line continued to divide the two countries. Once again, the Soviet Union and America had avoided open conflict. The fighting and destruction were confined to one small peninsula, but at the cost of millions of lives, civilians as well as soldiers.
Videocassette copies of this program are available to schools and colleges from their resource centers or from the Provincial Educational Media Center, 7351 Elm Bridge Way, Richmond, BC, V6X 1B8.